Let's read Matthew 23, verses 34 to 39. This is the discourse of Jesus to the scribes and the Pharisees. It's the culmination of that chapter that deals with the woes on scribes and Pharisees. Here Jesus stated, therefore indeed, I send you prophets. What Jesus is saying from that point on, this is just a few days before his death, by the way. He's saying, I send you prophets. In other words, I will send you prophets, wise men, and scribes. So the crucifixion of Christ was not the close of probation for the Jewish nation, because Jesus is promising after his death to do what? To send them prophets, wise men, and scribes. The prophets would be like Stephen. Did he have a prophetic vision? Yes. Was Peter also a prophet? Did he have a vision? Yes, he most certainly did. What about wise men? The 7 deacons are described as men full of wisdom. And who is the scribe or the theologian? The Apostle Paul. So Jesus is saying, I'm going to send you additional witnesses. And what will they do with them? The same thing that they did with Christ. Some of them you will kill and crucify. And some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city. And what is going to be the sentence as a result of persecuting Christ and then his people? It says in verse 35, that on you may come all the righteous what? Blood. See, that's one of the symbols in the first trumpet. All the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Assuredly, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Are you catching the picture? Fire mingled with blood. Now notice Ellen White's comment. This is in Great Controversy, page 28. Almost all of the statements that I'm going to read from Ellen White are from the chapter, The Destruction of Jerusalem. Notice this statement. The long-suffering of God toward Jerusalem only confirmed the Jews in their stubborn impenitence. In their hatred and cruelty toward the disciples of Jesus, they rejected the last offer of mercy. Then God withdrew his protection from them and removed his restraining power from Satan and his angels, and the nation was left to the control of the leader she had chosen. And, by the way, the book of Acts, you find a whole series of verses here in your study notes. You read the book of Acts and you see that the Jews were constantly appealing to the Roman rulers to persecute the Christians. In other words, they did the same thing that they did to Christ. So, in other words, God gave them great light first, before the Gentiles. They rejected the light by persecuting God's people, and for that reason, what did God do? We studied this, in our previous lesson. God allowed them to reap what they what? What they sowed, which is the judgment of the first trumpet. Now let's take a look at the symbol of thirds. You'll notice that the trumpets only afflict thirds. The trumpets don't afflict everything like the plagues. It's not the fullness of God's wrath. It's only partial. A third of the trees means that the trumpets were what? Partial and preliminary judgments that point forward to greater judgments in the future. The trumpet judgments fell on limited geographical areas, and they foreshadow the plagues that will fall globally. Ellen White repeatedly stated that the destruction of Jerusalem foreshadows the final destruction of the world. Now let's look at a couple of texts that use the word a third. By the way, the word third means a portion, simply. It doesn't represent 33.33%. It means a portion. In other words, these judgments don't afflict everyone everywhere. Notice Zechariah 13, verse 8, first of all in the King James Version. And it shall come to pass that in all the land, saith the Lord, 2 parts therein shall be cut off and die, but the third shall be left therein. So notice, it doesn't say 2/3, it says 2 what? 2 parts shall be cut off, but the third, It's understood that it's the third part. The third part shall be left therein. Notice Young's literal translation. And it shall come to pass in all the land an affirmation of Jehovah. 2 parts in it are cut off, they expire, and the third, that is understood, the third part is what? Is left in it. So we're to understand the word a third to refer to what? To a part or a portion. Now you say, how do we know that? Well, let's take a look at an interesting detail that Ellen White presents. The Bible tells us that God cast Satan out of heaven with how many of his angels? With a third of the angels of heaven. But according to Ellen White, a third actually means nearly 1/2. Thus, a third does not mean 33.3%. Not one more, not one less, but rather a fraction or a part of the angels. Notice this statement from the Story of Redemption, page 18. Satan had proved himself unworthy of a place in heaven. Then Satan exultingly pointed to his sympathizers, comprising nearly half of all the angels. Not 33%. Nearly half of the angels. And exclaimed, these are with me. Will you expel these also and make such a void in heaven? He then declared that he was prepared to resist the authority of Christ and to defend his place in heaven by force of might, strength against strength. So a third simply means that it's not an affliction that falls upon everyone everywhere. It means that it's a partial judgment that affects only some. It's a preliminary judgment. So a third of the trees in the first trumpet doesn't mean that we're supposed to look for a place on earth where a third of the trees were burned up, literally speaking. No. A third of the trees means a partial judgment upon people, we're going to notice, that foreshadows a greater global destruction at the end of time. Notably, in the 7 last plagues, God will pour out what? He will pour out the fullness of his wrath. Notice Revelation chapter 15, verse 1, the contrast between a third and the fullness. It says in Revelation 15, verse 1, then I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels having 7 last plagues. Just like you have 7 angels with 7 trumpets, pouring out partial judgments, represented by the word a third, a part. How many do the plagues affect? Oh, it says here, for in them the wrath of God is what? Complete. By the way, a better translation would be, the wrath of God is full. In other words, it will affect everyone, everywhere. Of course, excepting the remnant. Now, Ellen White wrote that the destruction of Jerusalem was the first draft. So that would indicate something partial too, right? Ellen White said that the destruction of Jerusalem, which we believe is the first trumpet, was the first draft of the cup that the wicked will have to drink fully during the plagues. Here's the statement, Great Controversy 21. By the way, all these statements that I'm going to read are from the chapter on the destruction of Jerusalem, interestingly enough. She wrote on page 21, in the temporal retribution about to fall upon her children, he saw but the what? He saw but the first draft from that cup of wrath, which at the final judgment she must drain to its dregs. Are you catching the picture? So what fell upon Jerusalem was only the first draft. A local judgment of God pointing forward to a much greater judgment. In fact, Ellen White has repeatedly statements where she says that the destruction of Jerusalem was a small-scale model, a partial model of what will happen all over the world with all of the wicked at the end of time. Notice these statements here that Ellen White uses. And these are from the chapter on the destruction of Jerusalem. It says, Christ saw in Jerusalem a symbol. What is greater, a symbol or what the symbol symbolizes? What the symbol symbolizes. You know, in the Old Testament, you have a lamb. It represented a much larger and greater reality, doesn't it? So Christ saw in Jerusalem a symbol of the world. hardened in unbelief and rebellion, and hastening on to meet the retributive judgments of God. And then she speaks about the sin of the Jews and compares it with the sin of the Christian world at the end of time. And by the way, they look like two different errors, but they really are the same error when you look at it carefully. On page 22, Ellen White wrote, Jesus, looking down to the last generation, saw the world involved in a deception similar to that which caused the destruction of Jerusalem. So the world is going to be guilty of a similar sin to the sin that was being practiced in Jerusalem. What was it? The great sin of the Jews was the rejection of whom? Of Christ. The great sin of the Christian world would be the rejection of what? Of the law of God, the foundation of His government in heaven and in earth. You say, well, that's two different, those are two different rejections. No, they're not. Let me ask you, the law is a reflection of whom? The law is a transcript of the character of Christ. So how can you say, I love Jesus, but I hate the law? I love the reality, but I hate the reflection. It's the same sin. The Jews rejected Christ. The Christian world will reject the reflection of Christ in His law. Are you with me or not? Notice this other statement, Great Controversy, page 25, also in the chapter on the destruction of Jerusalem. The prophecy which He uttered was twofold in its meaning. While foreshadowing the destruction of Jerusalem, it prefigured also the terrors of the last great day. So the judgment that fell on Jerusalem, was that a total and complete worldwide judgment? No, it was partial, indicated by the word, or the word, a third, right? Now notice this other statement, Great Controversy 36 and 37. The Savior's prophecy, this is on Matthew 24, concerning the visitation of judgments upon Jerusalem is to have what? Another fulfillment, of which that terrible desolation was what? But a faint shadow. In the fate of the chosen city, we may behold the doom of what? No longer local and partial. The doom of the world that has rejected God's mercy and trampled upon His law. Dark are the records of human misery that earth has witnessed during its long centuries of crime. The results of rejecting the authority of heaven. However, a scene yet darker is presented in the revelations of the future. The records of the past, the long procession of tumults, conflicts, and revolutions, the battle of the warrior with confused noise and garments rolled in blood. What are these? In contrast with the terrors of that day when the restraining Spirit of God shall be wholly withdrawn from the wicked, no longer to hold in check the outburst of human passion and satanic wrath. The world will then behold, as never before, the result of Satan's rule. Have you ever read chapter 1 of the book Great Controversy? Satan was in control of the nation. Mothers ate their children. People gnawed at the leather on their belts and their sandals because of the hunger. People betrayed one another. It was terrible. And yet that was only a foreshadowing of what is going to happen globally at the end of time, indicated by a third, a portion. In other words, so only a portion of God's wrath fell.